So very, very good evening to all of you. Well, it's good morning to Professor Grenoble and probably also Peter Austin. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for attending the lecture on a much relevant subject in today's linguistic world, that's urbanization, indigenous languages, and language shift. Professor Lenore Grenoble from University of Chicago is our guest speaker for this evening. And we are going to commence the session in a short while from now. Well, I am Vishakha, and it is my privilege to introduce the agenda for this evening and also introduce the distinguished speaker for this evening. At the onset, I would like to highlight the main objectives and activities of our society, the Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages, also called SEL. Most of us here know that Professor Kavita Rastogi founded the Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages in the year 2011, which was formally registered in 2015. And the society aims for maintenance and preservation of endangered and lesser known languages. Thus, the society focuses on the preparation of grammars and dictionaries of poor documented languages, prepare pedagogical grammars for such communities which are at significant risk of language loss. SEL also takes initiative of creating awareness of the mother tongue languages among such communities and take a lead in the social, economic, and cultural development of such communities. In addition, SEL also takes the responsibility to strengthen the documentation and preservation skills of the researchers through online lectures, training, and workshops. The SEL organizes various activities which are variously named as lecture series, web lecture series, language documentation series, and which are delivered by professors and experts from different universities and institutes in India and outside on various topics and various subjects. To mention a few lectures at random, we had lectures on phonetics and phonology, an interface by Professor Pandey, an introduction to Korsal by Professor Shobna Jalea, linguistic data management for language archiving by Dr. Karthik Narayan. Then Professor Sadaf Munsi from University of Texas delivered lecture on language endangerment, documentation, and revitalization, an integrated approach. Very recently, Dr. Shatrupa Datta Majumdar spoke on Kanashi, an endangered language of Northwest India, and such other lectures. SEL also conduct training and workshop like training on Prath, flex training, workshop on perception of tones, workshop on academic writing, video documentation for endangered languages, methods and techniques. Professor Anna Belew delivered lecture on sociolinguistic documentation and such other lectures, such other training. We also have activities named for SEL members, by SEL members series. In one such series, SEL members delivered lectures on domains of their research expertise. And in another series, SEL members presented their research findings and the senior SEL members provided them suggestions. Besides these and many more activities, SEL also provides platform to the researchers to present their work on lesser known languages. Thus, every year, SEL organizes International Conference for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages, also called ELKL, in various universities and institutes across the country. Recently, in the month of March, SEL organized the 11th International Conference for ELKL in Berhampur University in Orissa. And Professor Panchanan Mohanty was the conference chair. The keynote speaker was Professor David Bradley, and the two distinguished speakers of the conference were Professor Anna Ballou and Professor Lil Campbell. Finally, CEL gives permission to the researchers to publish their work on lesser-known languages in their peer-reviewed bilingual and biannual e-journal called Vak Manthan. A small section in the journal is also dedicated to the language activists who are deeply involved in the preservation of their indigenous languages. The founder and the president of CEL, Professor Kavita Rastogi, brings to us more and more innovative ideas, not only to promote lesser-known languages, but also to equip the researchers for this vital mission, save the mother tongue languages. Well, with all that said, I would like to introduce you all to our guest speaker for this evening, Professor Lenore Grenoble. Lenore A. Grenoble is a faculty in the Department of Linguistics, University of Chicago, since the year 2007. She has been honored with the name of John Matthews Manley Distinguished Service Professor in Linguistics. She is also a director in Arctic Linguistic Ecology Lab, MK Amosov Northeastern Federal University, Yakutsk in Russia. Professor Grenoble specializes in Slavic and Arctic indigenous languages. Her research focuses on the study of contact linguistics and language shift, discourse and conversation analysis, deixis, and issues in the study of language endangerment, attrition, and revitalization. She is presently involved in several collaborative projects that investigate the linguistic, social, and cognitive causes and outcomes of contact and shift, coupled with questions about the impact of urbanization and climate change on Arctic indigenous language vitality. Alongside these projects, Professor Grenoble is involved in research into language revitalization and how to create long-term sustainable language practices. Her current field and documentation work is centered in the Russian far north and Arctic, in Senegal, and in Greenland. Her work is empirically driven, and her current interests focus on language usage in multilingual settings, with particular attention to Arctic indigenous language communities. Professor Grenoble is the author of numerous articles and books, including deixis and information packaging in Russian, and language policy in the former Soviet Union, and co-author of Saving Languages, an Introduction to Language Revitalization, and a reference grammar for Evenki. She has co-edited multiple volumes, such as Endangered Languages, Language Documentation, Practices and Values, and most recently, Language Typology and Historical Contingency. Well, before I invite her to speak, I would tell the august audience that you may put down your queries at the end of the lecture or between the lecture in the chat section, and myself and Rohan will keep an eye out and will pass on the questions to the speaker. So with all that said, I would like to invite our guest speaker, Professor Lenore Grenoble. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's really a great honor, and I've been very happy to get to know about your society and have been sending some students your way too. So you may see an increase in membership since I'm trying to get anybody who's interested in India to get in touch with you. So let me see, can I share my slides? Let's see.
Yes.
1 second here. Okay. Hang on. Sorry. Always. Make a share screen. Can everyone see that okay? So I'll assume so, but sing out if you can't see this.
Yes,
There's
we
a
can
lot
see.
of slides, but don't be faint. We're not going to go through all of them, and some of them are pictures. I am going to talk about the work that I'm engaged in right now, and rather than give answers, I'm actually going to be asking more questions. So I will give you some background about urbanization as a whole, and then I want to talk a little bit about metrolingualism, and then we will look at some case studies in some different places. These are all Arctic places, which is where my work is focused right now, as you heard in the introduction. And so the climate, at least, is very different from what you are experiencing in India, as are the local language ecologies. But I think that some of the issues are very much the same, and we're seeing really big changes in the social structure in all of these places. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now, is actually the changes. Okay, I want to remind everybody, it's the I see I have the Russian version of this, sorry about that. It's the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And so I see this talk in the spirit of supporting Indigenous languages. That's from UNESCO's webpage. Sorry, I don't know why the Russian one is in there. And I would like to thank the sponsors for my research. I am funded, I'm in an unusual position, perhaps, being funded both by a very generous grant from the Russian government and a generous grant from the United States National Science Foundation. So these funds are sort of working in tandem right now. And I cannot say enough about the good work that my team, first my team in Yakutsk, this is less than half of the lab that we have in Yakutsk. You'll see this really is Arctic, so whereas other people have t-shirts for their labs or coats, we're wearing down vests because it's pretty cold there. But anyways, this is the this is some of the people in the linguistic ecology lab in Yakutsk, and we'll come up to the other team in Greenland in a few slides. So the questions that I'm asking without being able to answer at the moment, and it's not like I'm the first or the only one asking these questions, but really, what role does urbanization itself, urbanization as a factor, what role does it play in language use? And what's the linguistic life of a city dweller? Here I'm interested not only in the languages that you speak, but the soundscape of the city. What do you hear and what do you see? How do new languages enter the linguistic lives of city dwellers, and how do they leave? So globally, on a very large scale, we know there's a considerable urbanization, immigration, and internal migration. So what is the impact of all of this on the life of languages? And I want to underscore that I am, even though I'm saying life of languages, of course, language usage always involves people. And I'm not the kind of linguist who thinks you can take language away from the people and understand what's going on. But my big question here is what is going on in particular with indigenous languages as we have urbanization? So, one big question is, does multilingualism in the city differ, from rural areas? Sorry, a lot of typos there. And assuming that it does, then how does it differ? So if we look at, say, Frederica Lübke's work on small-scale multilingualism in Africa, we have one pocket of that still in Russia, maybe, it's pretty much gone, where people learn multiple languages, but there's not really she argues there's no real hierarchy between them. That's very different from what we see in world cities today, where there's a huge hierarchy across languages and across the different speakers of languages. So, how does the life of a plurilingual individual differ in the city versus the country or rural areas? And then a really technical question that I don't have good answers for, but I'd be very interested in hearing your take on is just how do we study urban multilingualism itself? So just for context, we see that the world is, this is data from the World Bank. At present, the world is 56% urban. You see a steady increase since 1960. The latest date is 2021 from when the World Bank has data. Did check this last night. But this is predicted to continue to rise. And so we see increasing urbanization as a major issue. If you look back at 2010, if you look back 1992, let's say, when a lot of work for linguists came out calling for people to look at endangered languages, you see there's this marked increase in urbanization since that time. And I don't think that we're addressing it fully yet. I looked at India and was surprised. This might be something you know, but only 35% of India is calculated as urban, which surprised me since India is also home to some of the largest cities in the world, and of course is one of the largest countries in the world in terms of population, but it's only calculated as 35% urban. Delhi is showing, which is the second largest city in the world, is showing marked growth, and it's projected to continue to grow. So if here in 2023, we're at almost 33 million, it's predicted to go up to 43 million by 2035. So urbanization is a factor, a major factor in life. If we go to, sorry, I'm still learning how to do the slides on the screen. Sorry. If we look in the Russian context, since we will be looking at some case studies there, you also see that the population in Moscow has steadily grown. It's somewhat leveling off, and it's nowhere near the kinds of projections that we get for Delhi, but it is the largest city in Russia by a long shot. So by 2050, the predictions of the World Bank are that by 2/3 of the world will be urban. Asia and Africa are going to see the largest numbers of urban dwellers and the fastest growth in urbanization, in part because they are more rural. And then critically, from the standpoint of the United Nations, there's 4 demographic megatrends that are affecting the planet: urbanization, population growth, aging, and international migration. And since we know that this is happening, my question is, how are these changes affecting Indigenous communities? So with that in mind, we want to also think about the fact that what counts as a city varies considerably, and that population size and density matter. Within the Arctic, cities are quite small compared to the South. People live a more city-like lifestyle, even in rural areas, in the sense that historically many of the rural areas had no running water, no heat, no electricity, and now they mostly do. At least they have electricity. At the places I work, they don't always have running water or central heating, but life has become more and more urban, so that's an issue of urbanism. So when I talk about cities being small compared to the South, the question is, what is the South? From the Arctic perspective, this is the view. Here's the North Pole. Some people have a hard time orienting themselves around this map, but this is the North Pole. Here's the Arctic Circle, and here is the line, this red line, which is a little bit south in many places of the Arctic Circle, is considered to be the area north of which there's Arctic population. So you can see it goes below the Arctic. There's very, very few people living right above the Arctic Circle, but there's more people here. Still very sparsely populated. And from the Arctic perspective, anything south of that line is south. So that includes Ottawa in Canada, Chicago, that's all south from that perspective. The cities in this area tend to be quite small. We'll look at some data in a second. So what we see is if we take the Russian Federation, where a lot of my work is focused, it's already at 75% urban. There's a little bit of a decline in the population, and migration is going on even today, which you might think about. In Greenland, which is the other place we're going to spend some time today, you see that the total population of all of Greenland is less than 57,000. But surprisingly, if you think of Greenland as a place that's inhabited by Inuit, it's surprising to see urban 88%. And they are also losing population, which is a big factor. We'll talk about that in a minute in terms of the dynamics in the sociolinguistic ecologies. So what is the source of population increase? Birth rates. The global fertility rate has declined as a whole, but it's still growing. The highest urbanization we see in North America, 82%, Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas Asia is down to about 50%. As I said, India is an outlier, it's on the low end. But we see India, China, and Nigeria predicted to account for considerable growth of the world's population. So as we move forward and think about this more concretely, I want to distinguish following the Council of Europe, and I use their French name since we're talking about multilingualism, the difference between multilingualism, the coexistence of different linguistic communities in a specific geographic area, and plurilingualism, which is the multilingual repertoire of individuals. So we can distinguish between multilingualism on a societal level and plurilingualism on the individual level. So some individuals are monolingual, some plurilingual. And we know that multilingualism can differ, how it plays out, differs in different places. I am increasingly interested in what Atsuji and Pennycook call metrolingualism. This is a term used to specifically describe the relations between language and the city, and their work focuses and defines metrolingualism as the everyday multilingual use in urban workplaces. The concept is often aligned with other concepts such as translanguaging and polylanguaging, especially in education. Metrolingualism has a particular focus on space, cafes, kitchens. Kitchens are really interesting metrolingual sites. And it's interested in everyday language practices and how diverse language uses are an intrinsic part of the city, emphasizing how different people, different interactions, semiotic and linguistic resources can come together at different times and places. And a lot of this foundational work is done in Australia, where the context is, the overarching linguistic context is, of course, one of English, with lots of other languages coming in particular in these workplaces in the large cities. So I think that that is a interesting way to think about what's going on in cities. And then there's some other work which was done in the Lucide project, which stands for Languages and Urban Communities Integration and Diversity for Europe. Although you see that they looked at 13 cities in Europe and 5 cities in Canada and Australia, so it's not really just European. But they distinguish between this list of, they include 5 spheres of multilingualism: education, urban spaces, the public sphere, everyday lives of citizens, the economic life of the city. And then I'm adding to this multilingualism in the home and metrolingualism, focusing more on the workplace. I think that we know, even if we don't have good quantitative data on this, at least qualitatively, that for indigenous languages and for languages with small numbers of speakers in general, multilingualism in the home is sort of the last place maybe where the language is used. And then the question really is what happens at the workplace too. So they define, the Lucide project defines the educational sphere as education and language learning for children and adults. And there's a tremendous amount of research on multilingualism in the educational sphere, in particular where the large languages are concerned. So English and Spanish, English and probably anything in India. Lots of work on this. For them, urban spaces includes publicly visible and audible languages. So looking at linguistic landscapes and soundscapes. And there's, of course, tremendous work being done on linguistic landscapes. And that's probably the most obvious way to capture the use of language in cities. But just because the language is on the sign doesn't mean that it's actively being used, or even that people are reading the sign in that language. They may just use the language of wider communication, the national language, where you have signs in multiple languages. The public sphere is defined in that project, the Lucide project, about measures by public authorities to boost the linguistic usage. And this, of course, is one area where language policy, this involves language policy. So if we want to think about promoting the sustainability of Indigenous languages, we want to have an impact on the public sphere, but this is generally not enough to promote the use as a whole. And then the multilingualism in the everyday lives of citizens, my question marks are here because I think that the label that they use is somewhat misleading. It means they're referring to migrant support organizations, festivals, cultural organizations, language clubs, and so forth and so on. So that's that's also a way that one can examine where spaces for language, but those are probably not sufficient to make a language vibrantly used. We'll look at some examples of those in a minute. So I'm very interested in figuring out how we can see multilingualism in the economic life of a city. So the role of language skills in different parts of the labor market, and if there are certain jobs that are linked to language skills, whether multilingualism is seen as an asset or not. And then are there spaces in the economic life of a city where we need to use Indigenous languages? I think not, unless they're very specific example places, and also depending on the city. But I think that this is one issue where Indigenous languages, one area or sphere, to use their terminology, is where Indigenous languages are getting pushed out. And then, of course, in the home, does language shift happen in the home? And do home practices differ in urban and rural spaces? In other words, if we know that the home is the last kind of place where the language is used, and we have an older generation speaking the mother tongue or the ancestral tongue, whatever you want to call it, and the younger generations coming home speaking the language of wider communication, does that different? Is that different in urban and rural spaces? Is living in a rural space a protective factor here, or does it not really make any difference? And then, of course, the metrolinguism, which I've spoken about. So if you just take a quick example of Chicago, where I live some of the time these days, it's a very multilingual city, and you see lots of signage. These signs are all taken, the students collected these in a linguistic landscape class. But you can see we have signs for voting in different languages, keep tranquilo and pray in Spanglish, a mixing of the language right on the sign, no smoking signs here in English, Spanish, and Polish, because there's a large Polish speaking community in Chicago. And these signs signal that you anticipate people are going to be using these different languages in those areas. So that's one obvious way to look at multilingualism. So let's look at some Arctic cases. And this is some work in Kirkenes, which was done before COVID. So Kirkenes is way up here, is Norway, Sweden. It's part of Norway, but it's right in this border area, very close to Finland. Here's Murmansk and Russia. This border is now closed, of course, very much closed, but there was a fair amount of traffic from Russia into Kirkenes before last year. And this is all Sami and Kven territory. So Sami and Kven are both indigenous groups, or Finno-Ugric. Kven is very closely related to Finnish and sometimes classified as a dialect of Finnish. It doesn't really matter from a linguistic standpoint. What matters very much is that the Kven see themselves as an indigenous minority, and they have suffered some of the same history as the Sami in terms of repression and or experienced serious language loss. So we did some work there. At the border crossing, you see here we're crossing, into or out of Schengen. You see the sign is multilingual, Norwegian, English, and then Russian. Clearly indexing that multilingual people are crossing the border. This is what the town looks like. I did this work with P-Lane and Olga Solovova in 2018, and we were looking specifically at linguistic landscapes at the time. This is a small town, 3,529, and you can see here, and I like this, it gives a good sense of what's going on a worldwide level. So we see the population, the largest group is Norwegian, they're Sami, as I said, an estimated 500 Russians, and that was a declining community at that time, Kvens and Finns, and then a relatively large group of refugees from Somali, and then others. So within this small little town, we have all these different ethnic groups and different languages spoken. So if you look at the linguistic landscape, just a couple of examples, here we have in the hospital, we see don't use perfume. Thank you for not using perfume. First in English, then in Sami, and then in Norwegian. So assuming that the readers, anybody entering, any patient or visitor to the hospital could read at least one of these languages, and the signs there are very clear. If you go into the stores, however, at the time, as I said, there were groups coming over from Russia, in particular to shop, and in particular to buy Pampers or disposable diapers. And so you see here in one of these big, massive stores where you can buy things in bulk, here's some Pampers that can be worn in the water. But above this is the sign, and says in Russian, Pampers, maximum 2 packages. Or here we see another sign saying video, whatever, surveillance, right? And then below that, it's written in Russian. So in the stores, we see lots of signage in Russian, whereas the hospital didn't have that at all. It assumed that anybody visiting the hospital would have English, if nothing else. Here we see these signs are completely aimed at the Russian speakers coming to shop. But then what we found to be very interesting is going into the hotels, and in the hotels, the staff were in Norway, are speaking among themselves in English. And we happened to hear and watch a meeting of the restaurant staff as they were given their orders for the beginning of the day before they would go out serving. It was all conducted in English. And so we interviewed hotel staff in Kirkenes, managers, anyone who could just talk to us. And they all said that, yes, the working language, this is the metrolingualism issue, the working language in the hotels is English because there's so many immigrants coming in who don't speak enough Norwegian to conduct all of the discussion in Norwegian. And so English has become the lingua franca in parts of Norway. Maybe this isn't surprising, but it was a sort of a wake-up call to see that it's spread like that. And so then the question is, what's happening elsewhere? So let's take a look at Greenland. We will fly to Greenland on Air Greenland from Copenhagen, just to give you a sense of a place that's very different from India. This is what it looks like at night. This is in January. And here's the team in Greenland. And I put up this picture particularly so you can see Cici, Tikayat, Ivalu, and Camilla are all Inuit. They are native to Greenland, most of them in Nuuk, and then Jessica's a postdoc on the project. But you can see even just in the pictures, it's a very urban environment. Tika and I are having a glass of wine in Pascucci, the cafe. Camilla and I are out for dinner at Unicorn. Cece's come to the office at the university. Ivalu's at the university. Jessica's here in the cafe. Very urban kind of setting. And we are in the capital, Nuuk. So a very different kind of city, but already you get the sense, as we were looking at Kirkenes with that population of 3,500, that counts as a city. Now, that's a very small city, especially by Indian standards. If we compare it to Delhi, it's kind of silly almost. and yet we are having these urban dynamics in that area. So we also see Greenland, very small country, less than 57,000 population, nearly 90% is Inuit, so indigenous, and then another probably 7.5% Danish, other Nordic countries, 1.1. And then we are very much concerned with this others figure. There's not great data on it, but 1.9% of the population others, and there's massive influx of immigrants from Thailand and the Philippines. And that's sort of the punchline of the whole story here, is that group of others is one major factor in driving language change. They are coming primarily to the largest city, the capital, Nuuk, which is again, not big, but it's big by Greenland standards. The second largest city, Sisimiut, is considerably smaller. And there's only 13 towns in Greenland with a population of over 1,000. So you have almost a third, or really a full third, of the country living in one city, the capital. The official language is Kalaallisut, which is an Inuit language, and it's the only Arctic indigenous language which is really robustly being learned and used by children. It's official, it's the national language, it's used in the school, it's used in all administration. You legally have the right to use it everywhere. But Danish, they were colonized by the Danes, and Danish continues to be a very strong language. It's the colonial language, and yet it has very strong presence since things are shipped to Greenland from Denmark. Food, workers come from Denmark because the population is so small, they don't really have enough people to staff everything. And then it's again, this others, this 1.9% are speaking English. They're coming from Thailand, as I said, the Philippines. Those are the main places, but some other places, they come, they don't learn Danish. They don't learn Kalaallisut from what we can tell. They're speaking English. And so English becomes the lingua franca, especially in these service encounters, just as we saw in Kirkenes, even though here the national language is Kalaallisut, and people care very much about their language and defend it very strongly. This is just a sense of where the towns all are. So here's Nuuk. The Arctic Circle is right about here. So Nuuk is just south of the Arctic Circle, but you can see very dispersed population. And of course, all of this is not inhabited. So what we see in the urban spaces, we see lots of signage in Danish and Kalaallisut. I think I have a next picture. Yeah, here's a picture. Here we see the Kalaallisut and Danish. There was a signage law that went into effect a few years ago, because before the signs were all in Danish. This means no entry. And the complaint was that the words in Kalaallisut are too long, and so they won't fit on the sign. And yet somehow they've managed to fit them all on the sign. So here's an official sign keeping people out. This is markers from COVID. I don't know how well this shows up on your screen, but here we have in Kalaallisut, keep your distance. Keep your distance. And there's another one in English, keep your distance, on the floor. So we see multilingualism even on the floor. And then this is the automat at the Nuuk airport, which I found really interesting. We see the handwritten sign saying it's out of service, English at the bottom, Kalaallisut at the top, Danish. But if you look at this printed sign, there's no Danish. It's just English and Kalaallisut. And there's sign indications like this that English is pushing out Danish as a lingua franca. If you're interested in the morphology here, this is the third person singular, and this is the plural. And I don't know why this is plural and that's singular, but they both mean out of order. So let's look at the Russian North and then come back to some of the other factors that are pushing English. This is in the summer. We are in Saskilach. This means I love Saskilach, far north. It's one of the northernmost inhabited places on the planet. And so this is a nice warm summer day. And we're finding very interesting sort of patterns of development in the Russian Arctic. we can just look at this quickly unless you really specifically care. Under the Soviet Union, the whole Arctic was the whole Siberia and the Russian Arctic was artificially developed with massive numbers of people sent there for industrialization. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the economic subsidies that supported all these people in factories disappeared overnight. And so there was economic catastrophe. Some of the villages had these massive unemployment rates of over 90%. This is actually a town of about 10,000 people, this picture, and you can see these are water barrels. They don't have any running water. They bring ice down from the mountains and let it sit in these barrels. But there is electricity in this part, so you can see this is what it looks like. So we saw a massive loss of population in the Russian Arctic right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. 10 people would leave, 6 people would come in. Now, 2009, for every 10 leaving, 8 people are coming in, and the population has been going up in general. If we look at the case of Magadan, the 2002 census from 1989 to 2010, just to give you a sense of how drastically the social conditions in these areas have changed. This massive population drop, both urban and rural. So dropping, you can see the numbers here, but even in the city, but at the same time, the percentage of the population that has moved into the city, into Magadan, has gone from 39% to 62%. So even in remote Siberia, where we have very low population density and net population loss, people are moving into the cities. So urbanization is a huge factor in the languages there. Within the Republic of Sakha, we see a real hierarchy of languages. It's somewhat similar to what we see in Greenland. We have the national language, which is Russian, and then a regional language of Sakha. There's maybe 500,000 speakers, so not a small language, although it is showing massive signs of shift. And then we have local indigenous languages, which have anywhere from a handful of speakers for one of the Yukagir languages to maybe 3,000-4,000 speakers, so very small. And then we see massive numbers of immigrants coming here for work. And the immigrants are coming largely from Central Asia, speaking Turkic languages. They do not learn Sakha, but they speak Russian. So Russian is spreading as a lingua franca because of this immigration. This just shows you the population density is 0.31 per square kilometer versus Moscow, where it's 8,537 per square kilometer. So we have less than 1 million people in a territory that is about 6 times the size of France. And this is where the lab is located, which is why I'm talking about it. So urbanization is a major stressor for all of the Arctic. As people move from small villages where they had daily face-to-face interaction, know all of their neighbors, and know who they can speak to in what language, they come into the city and there's no local neighborhood. The population numbers are just so small. Even in a small city like Yakutsk, there's too few indigenous individuals to form a neighborhood where the language lives. So there's no space for them to use their language outside of the home, except perhaps digital spaces. So the people are very active on WhatsApp, which is the major means of communication in Siberia. And so there are WhatsApp chat groups that use different languages only. And to be on that, to post anything on those chats, you generally need to use the language, although everybody has Russian, so they can switch into Russian, and many of them are, of course, trilingual. So they come into the cities with this growing population of immigrants. There's both permanent immigrants and seasonal workers who come in. They do not appear to learn Sakha at all, even though it would be much easier for them because they speak a Turkic language. But they come knowing Russian, and so they use Russian. It's promoting the use of Russian as a lingua franca. There are large enough numbers of immigrants that there are immigrant neighborhoods, and so there's spaces for the language use. Here's just some pictures. The produce, all of the produce, this is a region where things just don't grow. This is a picture from when I was there this past winter, and it is minus 45 Celsius in this picture. So it's freezing. So the growing season is short and not particularly good. So these these migrant workers are coming from the Caucasus, Central Asia, bringing produce largely, even here in the winter. You can see it's winter by her coat. And there's an entire region here, just close to the railroad station. Here's Yakutsk, the capital of the Sakha Republic. And it is also home to a third of the population. It's across the Lena River, and people from Yakutsk will go here to go shopping. And this is the one area, well, one of the areas where there's large immigrant population and they've settled. And so here you have a neighborhood where you can actually hear a language other than Russian or Sakha on the streets and some of the signage. There's a lot of Kyrgyz there. But that's rather unique, and it's difficult to get there. You need to take a ferry across the river. This is just, it's the postdoc showing that we have Pringles there, American chips. You can see massive kind of, shopping, a different kind of shopping situation. So one of the things that is happening with climate change in the Arctic is considerable flooding. There's flooding for a number of reasons, but one of the problems is the warming of the air temperatures is melting permafrost, and people in remote villages where the languages have been robustly maintained because they're so isolated have been flooded out of their homes. So Berezovka is an Evan, an indigenous dominant village. It's ethnically Evan, and Evan is still learned. These children almost certainly speak Evan, but this is a picture from the news story about how they are moving to the city because of the massive flooding. Now they've since built a new part of the village. The village is maybe 200 people. They built a new part on a hill, and people are moving back into Berezovka, but it's already fostered considerable language shift. So this is a picture of an Evan family and me. And this looks like it's a very rural area, but it's actually just a bedroom community on the edge of Yakutsk. It's a neighborhood that's known as the chicken factory because that's where the poultry farms are. And you can see this is a very traditional Evan family from Berezovka, the village that we just heard about the flooding from. And the grandmother is a master seamstress. She makes all the clothing, so we were trying on clothes. They were very anxious. That in the US, people get upset when they see me in the clothes, but they were very anxious for me to put the clothes on. This isn't seen as cultural appropriation, but rather a sign of respect that you put in their clothes. This is a yurt in their backyard because they miss the yurt that they live in, but they live in a house that looks like this. And Nikolai Semyonovich is probably the only monolingual speaker of Evan. He doesn't even understand Russian. Their daughter is fully bilingual, but her children do not speak Evan. They speak Russian. So we see language shift even across this very traditional family, probably because they're living right on the edge of the city, and the kids go into the city for school. The parents both work in the city, and so forth. So in terms of this public sphere that we noted before, in the city of Yakutsk, there are festivals. And so there's a festival for Northern peoples that takes place regularly, except during COVID, it didn't. And all the indigenous peoples of the Republic come there and they gather. But you can see this is a very urban setting. And this is a major cultural shift from performing your songs and dances in your community of 200 people where you all know one another to celebrate the solstice or whatever, reindeer festivals. Here we have a large public display. You can see stage, people seated here. This is a very different way of engaging with their culture. Here's some singers up on stage, and it's completely open. You get different groups coming and going, and this is the competition for circle dances of the peoples of the North. It's called the Sun Circle. This sign is entirely in Russian. It's not in an indigenous language or languages. It's all in Russian, which is the lingua franca. So even though this space is multicultural and theoretically multilingual, Russian is also the dominant lingua franca. Here are some of the festivals. If you've ever been to Siberia and you travel around, you see trees with pieces of cloth tied onto them. This is a way to communicate with the spirits and make a wish. This is a city one. This tree isn't really growing here. It's in a pot, and it's been erected just to have the salama. There's a city yurt. There's a reindeer hides on the outside of it, but of course nobody's actually living in that yurt. It's just there for cultural show, but it's not a deep. It's made the culture more of a museum piece, right? This is further north in Chukotka, where we are celebrating the Day of Russia, Dien России. It's like the national holiday. And again, this is a Chukchi. This guy is Chukchi, also indigenous, large festival, but again, a very urban festival. Here we are out in this celebrating. This is a more traditional kind of meeting of people celebrating the summer solstice and the breaking up of the ice. And this was all Chukchi, but here we have, of course, this is the national holiday. So lots of Russians, very urban. I just put this in to show there are there's public acknowledgements of language shift and language loss. So one of the things that's going on is the Saha language is written in Cyrillic, as is Russian, but it has some unique letters, unique for Saha, for sounds that are not in Russian. And these are considered to be endangered letters in the alphabet, mainly because they aren't on a normal keyboard. And so when people are texting, they'll either use, like this is a voice filler fricative. Instead of writing this letter, they'll write the number 5, or just write a G, or write an X, which is the voiceless velar fricative. So we see the lack of so the language activists, to put it more, are worried that these letters are disappearing from the alphabet because people are texting so much, and the young people just don't even care. They just write them, and they're losing the phonemic distinctions since Russian doesn't make these distinctions and just replace them with Russian sounds. So it's a kind of complicated picture. So instead of a conclusion, I was going to raise some questions, and I'll bring up one thing that I haven't mentioned yet. So how do these urban multilingual practices differ from rural multilingualism? We really need to study that more. I would say that we don't have a good sense of how people are actually using the languages. We're only touching the surface and primarily looking at these multilingual practices in cities. We're focusing very much, most of the research is on linguistic landscapes and in the classroom, where it's easier to get the data and perhaps easier to understand it. But are there communities of indigenous language users? You really need to know the city and the groups to know how often they're getting together, whether there's a nod to that or not, what's happening. Can we, how can we do this? How can we increase usage? It's some ways easier to create virtual spaces for indigenous language use, with the WhatsApp being a good example of that. In Greenland, everyone is on Facebook. They don't use WhatsApp, but they're all on Facebook, and the language is robustly used there. But when you hear people out on the street, even kids playing, they're mixing not only Greenlandic and Danish, but now a lot of English. So it would be really good to figure out how to capture that. What are the entry points for languages? One thing that I did not talk about in this is what for me has been very surprising, is, of course, the internet is a main pathway for language access, which can be good or bad, depending on try not to be judgmental. It can be create a space for Indigenous language use, or it can bring in other languages. And we are finding throughout Siberia, if there's connectivity, the children are learning Russian over YouTube. And we're finding in Greenland, the children are learning English over YouTube. And there's something about specifically all the parents and the teachers are consistently reporting YouTube as a major factor in the spread of major languages. Now, there is content for YouTube in Sakha, but not very much, nothing compared to what there is in Russian or English. Children are also learning English. And in Moscow, people report kids are learning English through YouTube. The teachers are also reporting that the YouTube is affecting their syntax, that they are learning to speak in, it needs to be studied because I don't really know what YouTube syntax is, but the kids are speaking differently. And I have seen in speaking with Greenlanders, young adults, 18, 20 people I've been working with in the project there who've learned English through YouTube and movies. Their English is very good. Their grammar is great. Their vocabulary is really great too, but they don't have a sense of pragmatics. So they don't have a sense of what's appropriate to say when. And they say things which I just find shocking. So, you know, Cece, you saw her picture. She came to first work with me, and she's been doing great work. But she, you know, came in one day and she said, "Oh, I did fuck all today." And, you know, none of my students would come to me in Chicago and say, "I did fuck all today." And I reported this to some students in a US university, and they were just shocked to think that somebody, so that's just one example, like a lot of swearing and overusage of that F word, and just sort of not even understanding different levels of politeness that are probably not explicitly taught in American culture, but we actually do have some. And so we see this very funny kind of acquisition in other, you know, very, very otherwise completely fluent speakers, really, really high quality English, except for these pragmatic things. So that's something that needs to be studied. The teachers in Siberia are saying that it's really affecting the kids' Russian, that they write differently, they speak differently in Russian because it's this YouTube Russian. So again, I don't really know what that is, but it merits some serious study. That seems to be how people are learning languages worldwide, from what I can tell. So to just kind of continue, we need to develop new research methods to study metrolingual language practices. It's much harder actually to work in cities and make connections with people than it is in villages because of the nature of cities. We need to really look at what's going on in the workplace and in the home, and it would be good to track some plurilingual individuals across their lives for, you know, a week, 2 weeks, to see where they're using what languages, when, how, with whom, how that changes. And then the other thing is that we have to keep in mind that these practices are dynamic. And I have seen significant changes in the use of Russian, English, Sakha over the last 5 years in the city of Yakutsk. So these language ecologies are constantly changing. And given the global predictions for migration, immigration, urbanization, we have to anticipate that they are going to continue to change. So just to end on a multilingual note, this is an example from a whiteboard in my colleague's office in Greenland. We are parsing the Danish. Well, this is in Kalaallisut, but the Kalaallisut, all of the news is translated from Danish into Kalaallisut, and it's completely distorting the Kalaallisut. So it's not just, the content isn't written initially in Kalaallisut. So it reads like translated Danish, and this is just parsing why that's so bad. And that's actually having a big effect on what's written too. So people get a bilingual newspaper online or in print, Danish and Kalaallisut. The Kalaallisut is unintelligible because it's not Kalaallisut. And so they just read the Danish anyways. Or there's a delay. So it's spreading Danish. So finally, thank you, Machtal. And this is the end. I will stop here and take any questions or open it up for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Grenoble. I was so engrossed in your lecture. And you gave so many research insights actually to work on multilingualism in a reference to Indian context also.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Well, I will read out few questions, which is in the chat section. One question is asked by Peter Rustin. This is, yeah.
I'm reading some of these questions. They're very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see the questions?
Yes, I can. So
Okay.
beginning with
So you can answer
urbanization.
accordingly. Yeah.
Yeah. So urbanization will cause more climate chaos. I agree. And I agree the global south is following the Western model without the resources that the West was able to accumulate. I completely agree. And actually, even the West as a whole is not homogeneous in terms of this. If I look at the United States versus Europe, so both areas have tremendous number of resources, but we can't get a climate policy through in the United States. I mean, we are the world's biggest consumers of everything. And it's heartbreaking to see that that's the model that people want to be like us, which is when the country is a mess. I don't know what to do about that. I agree completely. We're in this loop where urbanization is causing climate change and climate change is causing urbanization. And I have no idea how to get us out of that. Yes, Canada and Australia, European, everything. I agree. So yes, I mean, there's really this question. We have, let's see, is social class a factor? Yes, it does seem to be a factor. And it's in the areas where I'm working, it cuts both ways. So in Greenland, the educated elite tend to have a very strong commitment to speaking their language, and they are the activists who are fighting for it. That's also true. At least there's awareness. There's a lot of activism, surprising amount of activism in the Republic of Sakha among Sakha. And there's a parent group that is very actively trying to get more Sakha in the school where it's guaranteed by law, but it doesn't really happen because it has status as a regional language, which is possible there. Less like they. So I'm not sure. I think this question here. I'm seeing Nahid's point. The more middle class one is, the less likely they are to speak an indigenous language, preferring to communicate using a more dominant language such as English. I think that's an empirical question in the areas that I work in. I've been surprised in Greenland. I didn't go there for a while because of COVID. And when I came back, many of the people I had been speaking to in English had forgotten a lot of English. They use Kalaallisut at home. It is there's a very strong commitment to the use of Kalaallisut. Greenland is a unique place though. It's an island and it has more autonomy than most indigenous communities, certainly in the Arctic. Peter, let's see, demographic and geographical structures within a city can be important also. Absolutely, centripetal and centrifugal type, there may be opportunities for language culture. Yes. Yes, I think that we need to really think about the cities, and cities do differ. It's not just size that matters. I'm picking on that one because it's an obvious kind of factor, but understanding the dynamics of a city and even what a city means. I gave Kirkenes as an example, and we've got some interviews with speakers from small villages in Siberia who then go to the big city, which for them is a town of 2,000 people, but they feel like they've lost connection with the land because they're in this big city, whereas that's not a big city by our standpoint. So exactly what's going on, we need to really understand what's going on in the cities. Agreed. Case of my heritage language, villages 20 kilometers from the capital. Yeah, it's been made. The constant translanguage between regional by everyone in the committee is vibrant, but many people see it as endangered precisely because the boundaries between the codes are transgressed. Perhaps sometimes endangered language policies contribute to the essentialization of minoritized languages rather than promoting translanguaging policies. Do I have any thoughts on this? I do. I think that's a really good question. So the question, sort of to reframe it, one of the things we see with translanguaging practices is a very vibrant use of multiple languages at once. And it is true that I agree that endangered language policies, and I think linguists are very much at fault in terms of promoting the idea of a pure monolingual variety, which was perhaps always a fiction, but is even more so a fiction. So so we're adding these judgments that the translanguaging is bad or not, and yet this may be actually the most vibrant way for a language to continue, and that may be the thing that is most realistic. Certainly, many multilingual communities, if we look at the small scale multilingualism, some of them have different languages are used in different spaces, but some people just move fluidly back and forth between these languages. And translanguaging is a sign of vitality. I think that's something that we need to think about and promote and get away from, be very careful as we go in as linguists not to be promoting monolingualism as the key here, but actually to study these practices. So I think that's what's happening in Greenland. I think that's the way it's going to be going with what I'm hearing the kids use on the streets, this funny mix of Danish, something that sounds like English, and Kalaalleq, because the English, sometimes they're saying things that just don't make any sense to a speaker of English. But that may be the future and the way forward. It's essentializing, yes, definitely. This question about dominance of English, to me, it will be very interesting to see. To me, the dominance of English worldwide as it seems to continue to spread as a global language. And so when I find it catching on in Norway and Greenland, I'm very surprised. Be good to look in some other places, see where English is spreading. The role of religion. Do some religious practices support language maintenance in city settings? Yes and no, where I work. So Greenland is highly Lutheranized, and they became Lutherans in the 1700s. So there's a lot of Kalaalleq in the church because all of the Christian work was translated into Kalaalleq. So because there was a colonization without settlement. In terms of the indigenous practices in the Saha Republic, it's very interesting because they're very much alive among the Saha people. There's a large group of people who were traditionally animist shamanists, and they still practice those beliefs. And if you talk to them, they say, even those living in the city say that they are deeply connected to the land. They feed the spirits. You saw part of my team when we went to Saskilak, which was several days travel, and we took pancakes with us, because a bag of pancakes, because you feed the spirits pancakes. So there's this deep connection with that still. Certainly the communities that have shamans, including the smaller indigenous communities, have more robust language use. So there is an anchoring of the religious practices and language. What exactly is happening in the cities besides the Saha, besides these larger groups, Saha and the Inuit in Greenland? I don't know about the real minorities there and how much they're able to practice their religion in the cities. Promoting the use of accessible orthographies is a useful strategy to encourage the use of minoritized language. Yes, I think so. And what we're finding, at least where I'm working in terms of using of orthographies we're finding that the younger people are texting so much that it is having a big impact on the orthographies. I gave the Saha example with Cyrillic. Certainly in Canada with Inuktitut, a push away from the syllabic writing system to Romanized alphabet had a lot to do with young people texting. And we're also seeing anecdotally and I think it's going to turn out to be true once we figure out how to track it, that young people are shortening their words in Kalaallisut since it's polysynthetic and the words are very, very long, but it's a pain to text them. So they're making them shorter, and everyone in Greenland is noticing that young people are speaking differently. So it looks like, in addition to everything else, this is fueling rapid language change, although a lot of it is language internal, not contact induced, from what we can tell. Let's see. Valencia connects with cities and minorities languages, focus particularly on Catalan, Valencia, and Irish in Dublin. Okay. But how we study this in research methods, using mobile methods as part of ethnographic research in Dublin and Valencia, using observational walks around the city, looking at linguistic landscape and soundscape, using mobile interviews to situate interviews with participants within the city and speaking the languages myself in different areas of the city and in spaces associated with the language, and reflecting on my experiences in the fieldwork diary. Then tracking the routes. Oh, that's a good idea with Strava. That's a great idea. To make maps that show my experience with. That's a great way to just engage with it. So I don't know if everyone's reading this comment. Make maps show the experience with the language around the city, and participants can the connection between language and city. I think that's a great idea. That's a really great idea. Fascinating research. Yeah, I think that's a great idea with the maps. We were walking around Nuuk, we tried to do just observation and in service encounters, and also have people, of course, there's a lot of racial profiling, which is just what happens. So if you look like I do, 5-10 years ago in Greenland, if you walked up to a counter and asked for a cup of coffee or something, people would speak to me in Danish. Now they speak to me in English. So we've, with our team, we've been experimenting having people with different faces walk up and use different languages. And we're finding that some of the immigrant workers can do basic conversation in Kalaallisut. So you can order a cup of, but in a place like Pascucci, what you're ordering is a cappuccino, right? So it's pretty easy. That's what it's called in Kalaallisut. And see how far they can go in one language or the other, pushing the different languages. And pretty quickly they resort to English. And then there's some areas, some service encounters, no matter what you look like, even very older Inuit women are forced to speak English. So I really like the idea of mapping this as you go through it. That's a terrific idea. I'm going to do that. Our educated tend to employ language essentialism and denigrate working class. Yes, this is Martin's point about educated elite employing language essentialism. I think that seems to be a problem everywhere. The educated elite, the elders in many Indigenous communities also, and again, linguists, we are fortifying those attitudes ourselves. And this is one of the big challenges, I think, with documentation. We've all been sort of set on this pathway to documenting, the so-called last speakers. And we know that that's already a problematic category, but we continue to do that. And we need to actually, document the actual linguistic practices. So I think that's the end of the questions.
Any questions from anyone else? Well, I can see 2 in the chats. Well, it's thank you.
Yes.
Okay. I believe no one has questions. Professor Lenore, your lecture was so informative as well as interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you for
thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, viewers.
Thank you.
Okay, there is a question. There's a question by Martin. Is it? He wants to say something. Okay, it's in the chat. Okay,
where can you access the recording?
Okay, thank you for organizing. Thank you so much. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, Professor Grenoble.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great talking to you all. I wish we could do it in person, but it's great that we can do it.
Yes, we look forward to meet again.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
can we have a photo? I just forgot to say that. Rohan, can
Yes.
we have a photo? Can we all show our faces?
Yeah, we can do that.
Is it possible? I just forgot at the last moment, and so that would be a good memory to capture. Where is Peter?
I think he already left.
People can turn on their videos.
Please, can you show your faces? Yeah, oh, so nice.
Oh, it's nice to see everyone.
Yeah, nice to see everyone.
I appreciate you all sticking through this at the end of a long work day.
At least some of us are here.
Yes.
It's the middle of a bank holiday here in London in the middle of the
Yes.
day.
Yes,
Okay.
it's a bank holiday here too.
Okay. Okay. Rohan, are you capturing? Because he's taking care of this technical matters. Rohan, let me know, okay? Yeah. Done?
You're mute. Okay.
Oh yeah. I'm done with it. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, okay, great. Thank you.
That's
Thank you so much.
my sign to go.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.